We all know that Vikings were strong, fearsome warriors that would stop at nothing to plunder whatever they damn well please. But their strength is nothing compared to the barbarous Viking Berserkers, a class of insane motherfuckers that were more animal than man. Besides their ferocious fighting style and uncontrollable rage, these hardened warriors would gnaw at their own iron shields. In fact, there's an account of a Viking berserker who ate his whole shield. And I quote, "A demonical frenzy suddenly took him. He furiously bit and devoured the edges of his shield. He kept gulping down fiery coals. He snatched live embers in his mouth and let them pass down into his entrails. He rushed through the perils of crackling fires, and at last, when he had raved through every sort of madness, he turned his sword with raging hand against the hearts of 6 of his champions. Their intoxication and rage for battle was so intense that their condition was labeled Berserkergang, i.e. berserker fit or frenzy. It was characterized by performing impossible feats of human strength, intense bouts of rage, and howling like a wild animal. In this state, all capacity for human thought/reason was out the door, as these crazed warriors would rip their enemies to shreds with their bare fucking hands. These intense shifts in mood were often referred to as hamask, which translates to change form, usually as a bear or wolf. Now, they didn't literally change form, but their dedication was such that they would emulate a bear or wolf by living in the woods and literally acting like a wild beast. Ah, roleplay, isn't it fun?
All right, let's do this.
Come on, try.
Ahoy, thar be boobies.
You're ruining it. I want you to take me like Captain Jack Sparrow.
And as a final ritual before entering the battle, the Viking berserker would drink the blood of a bear or wolf. Sounds nutritious.
I drink human blood as much as I can.
Because they sought to transform themselves, they usually entered the fray with nothing but an animal pelt. Their weapons? Hands and teeth, son! They literally ripped their enemies apart like primal beasts. To attain these crazed states, some authors have suggested that these berserkers were tripping on mushrooms. In the Journal of Psychiatry, Howard Fabing hypothesized that berserkers may have taken the amanita muscaria, a psychedelic mushroom that looks somewhat similar to the growth mushroom in Super Mario Bros. Further justification is provided by Paul Stamets, who noticed that the sword handles of the Vikings bared a resemblance, and in some cases, a taxonomically correct depiction of the Amanita muscaria. Interesting side note, the Amanita muscaria may have been the inspiration behind Christmas, as these mushrooms typically grow under conifer or birch trees, and have a distinct red and white appearance, not unlike Christmas presents. Reindeer, as it so happens, love eating the Amanita muscaria, and when doing so, when they're bent to the ground eating the mushroom, it may appear that their own nose is red.
Somebody start having a little private party. You know what I'm saying? I think you do. As for who, well, you ever wonder how his nose got so red?
The whole flying aspect might be attributed to the fact that people who consumed the mushroom were imagining this phenomena. They literally thought the reindeer might have been flying, and they also get the sensation of flying themselves. So one would think if reindeer were taking it, they would be imagining themselves flying as well.
Whoa! What the?
Shamans typically were the ones handing out the mushrooms, and would dress in apparel that matched the mushroom's appearance, not unlike Santa Claus, and would hand out the mushroom during the winter solstice. Also, according to some historians, these practices occurred in Siberia, which is reminiscent of the North Pole. And because there is an abundance of snow in this region, doors would often be blocked. Thus, the shamans would enter and exit through the roof.
Hey, yo! What's up? Oh! Whoa, whoa!
And as a reward for doing so, people would often give them food for their services. Milk and cookies much? One last piece of information regarding the Amanita muscaria that you might find interesting is the idea put forth by John Marco Allegro in his book, The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. While controversial, Allegro put forth the idea that Jesus was code for a type of hallucinogen, i.e. the Amanita muscaria, and that the New Testament is a coded record for a shamanistic cult. Now, before you disregard this information on the mere face of it, Mr. Allegro was a scholar of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are ancient Jewish religious manuscripts, which gives some credence to the words he speaks. Now, back to the Viking berserkers. It may be that the Amanita muscaria had no role in the offbeat moods of these crazed warriors, and in fact, may have been caused by a mental disorder, e.g. schizophrenia, or even excessive alcohol consumption.
To alcohol, the cause of and solution to all of life's problems.
Whatever the case may be, I think we can all agree that these were some unhinged warriors who would have been scary to meet in the battlefield. So scary that some historians believe that they may have inspired the legends of werewolves, or even the horrifying beast Grendel from Beowulf. In any case, I hope you found this information regarding Viking berserkers interesting.
Canute steps into it.
Bruh.
So, there's this moment in episode 7 of Vinland Saga that will have you scratching your head. At first glance, it seems absurd to think that 20 to 30 young Vikings could carry an entire boat across a field, never mind the fact that they are running with it. Of course, we've all been told the tales of incredibly strong, savage Vikings that terrorized numerous villages of Europe to plunder riches. They even went as far as to raid religious sites due to their vast amount of wealth and insufficient defenses. But what you may not know is that Vikings were strategic with their attacks, often planning them out in advance by utilizing spies to determine when local customs/feasts were occurring, thus catching the villagers in a vulnerable disposition. Combine this with their longships that could traverse shallow waters, allowing them to swiftly raid a village and escape just as quickly, and they were nigh unbeatable. However, due to various complications, some rivers proved unnavigable. Not easily deterred, the Vikings employed unique techniques and brute strength to accomplish this seemingly impossible feat. The first method included putting wooden poles through oar holes to carry the boat to its desired location. It was strenuous work, even for a hardened Viking, but no price was too high for the elements of surprise. This method is all well and good for smaller boats, but bigger boats required a bit more ingenuity. This is when the Vikings implemented rollers, or trees that were cut down and stripped of all its branches so that the boat could roll across the land. They would do this by rolling the boat across the rollers, the trees, and then taking the last tree and putting it back in the front of the line, doing this continuously until they got to the destination that they so desired. By utilizing this technique, the Vikings could traverse large areas of land, and historians have demonstrated that this method was used in Russia to get to the Black Sea, in which they covered 10 kilometers of land. 10 fucking kilometers! Of course, these two methods are a far cry from what happened in Vinland Saga, especially considering that Askeladd is standing in the boat. Not cool, bro. What the fuck? Adding to the weight they had to carry. That being said, that's the beauty of an artistic medium. You can tell a real-ish story with creative nuances to keep the viewer entertained. As long as the characters seem real and their actions aren't too absurd, then impractical, diverting flourishes are welcomed and serve a useful purpose. That being said, what did you think of the Vikings carrying the boats in Vinland Saga? Was it too unrealistic to be taken seriously? Or an exhilarating sequence of events that did a good job of balancing realism with excitement? Let me know in the comments. Prince Canute is finally starting to open up as a person via outburst, more outburst, and you guessed it, cooking lessons. But in all seriousness, his character is in the beginning stages of being fleshed out, which makes this a perfect opportunity to give you a little background knowledge on Canute the Great and his familial lineage. To start, Canute was a Danish prince and the son of Sven Forkbeard, king of Denmark. But Canute's father was not your typical indolent king. Far from it. Sven was a violent warlord that usurped the throne held by his father, Harold Bluetooth. Why did they call him Bluetooth? Because he filed his fucking teeth and dyed them blue, son. YOLO! But after conquering the throne, not one to rest on his laurels, King Sven turned his attention to England in what was described by historians as a campaign of fear and destruction. Eat your heart out, George W. Bush! During this time, circa 1985 to 1995 AD, Prince Canute was born and would eventually travel to England to engage in various raids under the care of Thorkel the Tall. Historical accounts describe Canute as an exceptionally tall and strong individual. What? This guy? Seriously? In any case, after years of raiding English villages, King Sven personally led his forces in a full-scale assault of England. But the Londoners did not give way, thanks to the help of the defected Viking leader, Thorkel the Tall. Eventually, though, the King of England, King Ethelred, under immense pressure, went into exile, and Sven was declared King of England on the Christmas of 1013. But King Sven's reign of England was cut short when he died on February 3rd of 1014, having ruled only a mere 5 weeks. But in King Sven's absence, who would rule England and Denmark? If you do not want to be spoiled by future events in Vinland Saga, you should tune out right now, because this is potentially a big spoiler alert. After Sven's death, Harold II, Canute's older brother, was named King of Denmark, while Canute was proclaimed King of England. However, his reign was also brief, as the English nobility sent for Ethelred, who eventually came out of exile. Canute, henceforth, was driven out of England in 1014, in which he barely escaped by boat. But before Canute fled to Denmark, he made certain to intimidate England via returning various hostages without their ears and noses, a stark warning that they did not see coming. In the meantime, Canute decided to build his army for an invasion in the near future. And that near future was literally next year. In the summer of 1015, Canute returned to England with vengeance and domination on his mind, spending the next few months conquering and pillaging various villages. During this time, King Ethelred decided to defend London, accompanied by his son Edmund Ironside. Shortly afterwards, though, Ethelred passed away, leaving Edmund as the new king of England. This changing of the throne sparked a ferocious war between Edmund and Canute, ending in triumph for Canute on October 18th at the Battle of Assendon. Edmund, forced to flee for his life, was caught by Canute in Gloucestershire in October of 1016. While you may think that Canute was out to finish the job, this was actually a placid encounter between the two, one in which Canute agreed to divide England, possibly because he knew the consequences of his previous failure in capturing the supports of the country. Therefore, Edmund was given the kingdom of Wessex, while Canute took control of the rest of England. Now, an interesting stipulation was put in place. That being, when one of the kings should die, the other would take all of England. Well, as it so happens, Edmund, who was only 26 years old at the time, ended up dying just a few weeks later. Now, no one knows for certain what happened, but given the callous nature of Canute, it's not a far cry to believe that he may have been involved in Edmund's assassination. One theory suggests that Edmund was stabbed multiple times while taking a leak. Hey, way to go! Way to piss your life away! Now, after Canute took over England, a few years afterward, his older brother, Harold II, who was still the king of Denmark at the time, ended up passing away. When he passed away in 1018, there was no apparent heir to the throne. Harold had no offspring that would have been in line. Therefore, Canute, ever the opportunist, took Denmark for himself without much resistance. Now, with two countries under his dominion, you would think that Canute would be satisfied with his accomplishments. But this couldn't be further from the truth. And any knowledgeable historian knows that an emperor does not stop conquering unless someone stops them by force. So in the year 1028, after returning from a religious trip in Rome, Canute decided to return home and declared Norway and Sweden part of his kingdom. And in 1028, he sent 50 ships over to Norway and was able to take the country relatively easily. That being said, however, even though he had England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden under his control, it proved to be a little bit too much, and he never really got the support of Norway that he would have liked, especially with the upper nobility. So after 2 short years in 1030, Norway went back to the original nobility, and Canute just went back to ruling England and Denmark once again. Now it's interesting because after Canute died in 1035, England actually went back to the original familial lineage of kingship. So they got rid of the Denmark influence and just carried on as if nothing happened. But it's quite the impressive tale for a young prince who was second in line to the throne of Denmark to not only become the king of Denmark, but also the king of England, Norway, and Sweden all at once, albeit very briefly. Very impressive accomplishments and quite the legacy to leave. In the latest episode of Vinland Saga, episode 13, we were led to believe that Askeladd was a descendant of Artorius, a man who could have been the historical basis for King Arthur. But before we open that can of worms, let's investigate the historical records of this enigmatic officer of the Roman army. For the majority of his military career, Artorius carried the rank of centurion, i.e. an officer that commanded 100 or century of men. 4 out of the 5 men in the century were legionaries, or professional heavy infantrymen. These Roman soldiers were the preeminent fighting force of their time, and their effectiveness in battle was recognized by various commentators even centuries after their disappearance. The remaining 20% of the century constituted servants and orderlies. In terms of Artorius' floor writ, i.e. the date or period in which the person was active or alive, experts are in disagreement, as no dates are given on the various inscriptions on his sarcophagus or memorial plaque. It is suggested, however, that his floor writ was between the mid-late 2nd century AD or early to mid-3rd century AD. According to recent dating, scholars now believe that fragments of the sarcophagus date to no later than 200 AD. Meaning that Artorius probably died before that time, and would not have been alive during the 3rd century as previously suggested. Unless, of course, Artorius had his sarcophagus made before his death. You know, just to hang out in and take quick power naps in.
The dead man's curve!
Oh, the living.
After years, possibly decades of being a centurion, Artorius, in his old age, achieved the rank of prefect, a military role reserved for 50 to 60-year-old men who had been in the army most of their lives. Duties as a prefect included maintenance of the fortress in which they were guarding, and authority over the food supplies, munitions, and equipment. As you can imagine, this role saw very little fighting and was mostly administrative in nature. Before finishing his career, however, Artorius led an expedition as a dux, or a general in charge of 2 or more legions, against either the Armacans, the part of Gaul between Seine and Loire River, which is now part of the modern-day Brittany and western France, or the Armenians. Because of the campaign in Armacan, i.e. Brittany, and the various other military accolades that he achieved in his lifetime, and the plausibility of the Welsh name Arthur deriving from the Latin Artorius, was enough for one man, Kemp Malone, a medievalist, etymologist, and philologist, to make the connection between the two. That being said, King Arthur, if he was a real person, is speculated to have lived during the 5th and 6th centuries, which would have been 200 to 300 years before Artorius' time. Also, many of the inscriptions on Artorius' sarcophagus are open to interpretation, which makes it very difficult to attribute certain achievements to Arthur's legacy. Thus, Malone's ideas were disregarded for decades, until Helmut Nickel came along and introduced a theory known as the Sarmatian connection. Under this supposition, Nickel postulates that a group of Sarmatian cavalry serving under Artorius inspired the Knights of the Round Table, and kept his legacy alive over the centuries, eventually blending in the myths of the magical sword and the cauldrons. A few years later, independent of Nickel's work, Covington Scott Littleton, an anthropologist, expanded upon the Sarmatian connection theory, arguing that elements of Arthur's story derived from Caucasian mythology. While the evidence of Kemp Malone, Helmut Nickel, and Covington Littleton is fascinating, many Arthurian scholars have concluded that their deductions are based on conjecture and weak connections. I do find it interesting, however, that the man who could have inspired the enigmatic, possibly fictitious King Arthur may have also been fabricated himself. As a side note, the Sarmatian connection served as a basis for the 2004 film King Arthur, directed by Antoni Fuqua. In any case, whatever you choose to believe is your own prerogative. I just wanted to provide some information on Artorius since he was mentioned in Vinland Saga, and the little connection that some people and films have made with Artorius and King Arthur. That being said, I hope you enjoyed this little Vinland Saga history lesson, and I'll catch you on the flip side.
Don't you have satellite TV?
Well, no,
Muffy does. Maybe she'll even invite you over sometime.
I am the one, the way your son don't need a gun to get